Imagine walking into a courtroom believing in justice, only to be laughed at by the very person meant to uphold it. But what happens next? No one saw it coming. Stay tuned because this story will leave you speechless. And hey, if you love powerful stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Now, let's dive in. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with murmurs and hidden smirks. At the center of it all stood Riley Carter, a black teenage girl, her hands clasped before her, expression calm. Across from her, Judge Harland Graves, known for his sharp tongue and intolerance for what he called disruptions, leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with amusement. "You think you can fool this court?" the judge sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. He chuckled, shaking his head. "This isn't a school play, young lady. Did you seriously come here to represent yourself?" A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Even the prosecution smirked. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, sensing the humiliation in the air. But Riley, she didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her chin and spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the law doesn't exclude anyone based on age. If you prefer, I can cite the specific precedents that allow me to represent my client." The room stilled. The confidence in her voice was undeniable. The judge's smirk faltered for just a second before he scoffed. "Cute, you memorized some legal jargon. That doesn't make you an attorney." But then, she began to speak. Riley dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, pointing out contradictions in the evidence, citing laws that seasoned lawyers had overlooked. Her delivery was sharp, calculated, like a trained professional, not a high schooler. The smirks vanished. Judge Graves leaned forward, frowning. The prosecutor, who had moments ago been amused, suddenly looked uncomfortable, flipping through his notes as if trying to find something, anything, to counter her. And then, "I object," the prosecutor barked, his face red. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe this. This individual is not who she claims to be." A stunned silence followed. The tension was suffocating. Riley turned, meeting his eyes, her expression unreadable. "I assure you, everything I've said is legally sound. But if my qualifications are in question..." She reached into her bag and pulled out a crisp, pristine document. The bailiff took it and passed it to the judge. As soon as Judge Graves read the contents, his entire demeanor changed. His lips parted slightly, his hands tightening around the paper. The color drained from his face. His eyes flicked up to Riley in disbelief, then back down to the document. The courtroom held its breath. Who was this girl? What had he just read? Now let's rewind to where it all began. The weight of the judge's gaze settled on her like a spotlight, unflinching and heavy. He gripped the document tighter, his fingers pressing into the edges as if the words would shift under his grasp. His mouth opened, then closed, his mind trying to process what he had just read. The room held its breath. Even the prosecutor, who had been sneering just moments ago, sat frozen, his confidence now tainted with something closer to fear. "Miss Carter." The judge's voice was quieter now, but sharp, slicing through the silence. "Who exactly are you?" Riley didn't flinch. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just met his stare with an unwavering calm. "Your Honor, I believe my credentials speak for themselves. Now, if there are no further interruptions, I'd like to proceed with the case." The air in the courtroom was thick with uncertainty. Even the bailiff, who had stood rigid and impassive since the trial began, stole a glance at the judge, waiting for his response. A long pause. Then, with a slow exhale, Judge Graves straightened in his seat, masking his unease behind a scowl. "Proceed." But the way he said it, the flicker of something uneasy in his eyes, made one thing clear. This wasn't over. Not even close. The night air in Baltimore carried a chill, but Riley barely felt it. She moved quickly through the quiet streets, the faint hum of streetlights overhead casting long shadows against the pavement. At 17, she had long learned that the world didn't wait for kids like her to grow up. If she wanted justice, she had to take it. Evelyn Carter's voice echoed in her mind, her grandmother's warning from earlier that evening. "You can't take on the whole system by yourself, Riley." Maybe not. But she could start with one case. The moment she'd overheard Jasmine Lewis at the corner store, everything had clicked into place. The desperation in her voice. The way she clutched her son close as she pleaded with the cashier, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her. "I paid my rent. Every dime. But my landlord says I broke the lease. I didn't. I swear I didn't." The words had stopped Riley in her tracks. "What did he say you violated?" she had asked. Jasmine had blinked at her, eyes wary but exhausted. "He claims I had unauthorized tenants, but it's just me and my son," Riley had nodded. "Do you have a copy of your lease? Proof of your payments?" Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I keep everything in a folder at home, but let me help you." A pause. "But you're just a kid." "I've been told that before," Riley had replied. The case unfolded quickly. Jasmine's lease agreement, her bank statements, everything proved she had followed the rules. But the real discovery came late at night, after hours of scanning records and cross-referencing complaints from other tenants. The landlord, Glenn Mathers, had been running the same scam for years. Accuse tenants of violations, evict them, raise the rent, repeat. Riley had sent a formal legal demand to stop the eviction. Mathers had ignored it. So she had helped Jasmine file a case against him. Word spread fast. A 17-year-old taking the landlord to court. People whispered. Some laughed. Others doubted. Then the media caught wind of it. The first headline was small, tucked into a local newspaper. Teenager challenges landlord over alleged fraud. Then, bigger outlets picked it up. Reporters showed up at the courthouse, cameras flashing. It wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. It was about every tenant Mathers had scammed. By the time the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, lawyers, law students eager to see the so-called kid lawyer in action. Jasmine's hands were trembling. "Are you nervous?" Riley glanced around the room, at the skeptical faces, the smirking attorneys, the looming presence of Judge Graves. Then she turned back to Jasmine and whispered, "They're laughing because they're scared." Before Jasmine could respond, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harlan Graves." Silence fell. The judge entered, his robe sweeping behind him as he settled into his seat. Then, his gaze landed directly on Riley, his lips curled into a slow, deliberate smirk. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" His tone dripped with amusement, daring her to prove him wrong. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Attorneys exchanged glances. The prosecutor folded his arms, watching her like she was a joke about to collapse in on itself. Riley stood, steady and unshaken. "I'm here to represent my client, Your Honor." Judge Graves let out a low chuckle. "You must be joking." More laughter, whispers. Riley didn't react because she was ready. Judge Harlan Graves leaned back in his chair, watching her with a smirk that barely hid his skepticism. The courtroom murmured, the disbelief thick enough to choke on. A teenager standing alone at the plaintiff's table, facing off against seasoned attorneys. It was laughable. "Miss Carter," the judge said, voice laced with condescension. "I assume you understand the seriousness of these proceedings?" Riley met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." A scoff came from the defense table. Glenn Mathers sat beside his lawyer, Richard Calloway, a corporate bulldog in an expensive suit. Calloway barely looked at Riley as he shuffled his papers, his confidence unwavering. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the courtroom to hear. Judge Graves tapped his gavel once. "Since we're apparently indulging this experiment, Miss Carter, you may begin." Riley stepped forward, placing a neatly organized stack of documents on the table in front of her. The weight of every eye in the room pressed against her, waiting for her to stumble. But she didn't. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "this case isn't complicated. It's about a landlord abusing his power. My client, Jasmine Lewis, followed every rule, paid her rent on time, kept her apartment in perfect condition, and yet she was served an eviction notice for a violation that doesn't exist." Calloway let out a dramatic sigh and stood. "Objection, Your Honor, this." Riley didn't flinch. "I have evidence to prove it." That shut him up. She reached for the documents, flipping through them with precision. "Here is my client's lease agreement, signed and dated. Nowhere does it restrict occupancy to a specific number of visitors. Yet, Mr. Mathers claims she violated her lease by allowing unauthorized tenants to live there. We requested proof of this violation. The defense provided nothing." Judge Graves glanced at Calloway. "Is that true?" Calloway adjusted his tie, recovering quickly. "Your Honor, the burden of proof isn't on us, it's on the plaintiff. And unless Miss Carter has something more substantial than a lease agreement, this is a waste of the court's time." Riley didn't blink. "I thought you might say that." She slid another paper across the table. This is a record of text messages between my client and Mr. Mathers. In them, he repeatedly avoids explaining the eviction and instead suggests that she just leave quietly. Why would an honest landlord do that? A ripple of whispers ran through the room. Mathers shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face turning red. Calloway snatched the paper, scanning it with narrowed eyes. Your Honor, anyone can fabricate text messages without verification. I anticipated that, Riley said smoothly, so I had them authenticated by a digital forensics expert. She slid another document forward. Calloway's jaw tightened. Judge Graves took the report, his expression unreadable as he skimmed through it. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Riley pressed forward. Not only that, but we discovered a pattern. Mr. Mathers has done this before, several times. I have signed statements from former tenants, all describing the same scheme. He accuses them of a violation, evicts them, and then raises the rent before leasing the unit to someone else. Calloway stood abruptly. Objection. Overruled, Judge Graves said, his tone sharper now. He turned to Riley. Continue. She could feel it now, the shift in the room. The defense had walked in thinking this was a joke, but no one was laughing anymore. The evidence is clear, Your Honor, she said, her voice unwavering. This isn't just about Jasmine Lewis. It's about every tenant who's been forced out under false pretenses. Mr. Mathers has been running a scam, and now he's trying to silence my client for exposing it. Mathers bolted up, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. That girl, she's making all this up. Judge Graves slammed his gavel. Sit down, Mr. Mathers. Riley remained perfectly still, watching him unravel. This was what she had been waiting for. Judge Graves sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Carter, do you have a witness to support these claims? Riley nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tile. She was in her early 40s, well-dressed, poised, but there was something nervous in the way she clenched her hands. This is Andrea Sinclair, Riley announced. She worked for Mr. Mathers for over 10 years as a leasing agent. Mathers' expression darkened. Calloway whispered something to him, his posture stiffening. Judge Graves motioned for Andrea to step forward. Miss Sinclair, do you understand that you're under oath? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Riley turned to her. Miss Sinclair, did you personally witness Mr. Mathers evicting tenants under false pretenses? Andrea hesitated. Her eyes flicked to Mathers, then to Riley. Yes, she said finally. I did. A sharp collective inhale filled the courtroom. Riley stepped closer. How many times? Andrea swallowed hard. More than a dozen. Mathers slammed his fist against the table. She's lying. Enough. Judge Graves banged his gavel, silencing the outburst. He turned to Andrea. Do you have documentation to support this claim? Andrea reached into her purse and pulled out a thick folder. I brought copies of the lease agreements and internal emails. They show the pattern. Calloway looked pale now. He leaned toward Mathers, whispering furiously. Judge Graves exhaled slowly, flipping through the papers. Then, for the first time since the trial started, his gaze landed back on Riley, not with amusement, but something closer to respect. The room was silent. Then, in a voice quieter but firmer than before, Judge Graves spoke. This court will recess for 10 minutes while I review the evidence. Riley sat down, exhaling as the tension finally cracked. Jasmine grabbed her hand under the table, squeezing tight. For the first time since the case began, the tide was turning. But Riley knew better than anyone. This wasn't over yet. Judge Graves disappeared into his chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with hushed conversations. Riley sat motionless, her fingers lightly tapping against the table. Jasmine's grip on her arm was tight, as if letting go would shatter the fragile hope that had just begun to take form. You think he's actually going to do something? Jasmine whispered. Riley didn't answer right away. The judge had looked at her differently before recess. The smug amusement was gone, replaced with something heavier, thoughtful. He knew what Mathers had been doing. The question was, did he care enough to hold him accountable? We'll find out soon, Riley said. The heavy courtroom doors swung open and Judge Graves reappeared. He moved slowly to his seat, his face unreadable as he glanced at the thick folder Andrea Sinclair had handed over. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence submitted by the plaintiff, I find cause for further investigation into Mr. Mather's eviction practices. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Riley barely reacted, but inside, adrenaline spiked through her veins. She had expected the judge to dismiss the claims, maybe brush them off as circumstantial. This was progress. Calloway shot up from his seat, his face tight with barely restrained frustration. Your Honor, these documents are unverified. This is nothing more than hearsay and baseless accusations. Judge Graves held up a hand. I'm not making a ruling yet, Mr. Calloway, but given the weight of these allegations, I will allow this case to proceed to full trial. Mathers slammed his hand on the table. This is a damn witch hunt. Graves's gaze snapped to him. Mr. Mathers, if you interrupt me again, I will hold you in contempt of court. Sit down. Mathers sank into his chair, his face red with rage. Calloway muttered something under his breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. They hadn't expected this. They thought they'd crush Riley with technicalities, overwhelm her with legal red tape. But now, they were stuck. Jasmine let out a shaky breath. Oh my God, we're actually doing this. Riley nodded, but something wasn't right. This was too easy. Mathers had been getting away with this for years. He wouldn't just roll over now. The judge tapped his gavel. We will reconvene in 2 weeks. Both sides will prepare their arguments. Court is adjourned. Riley stood, but before she could gather her files, Calloway was already moving toward her. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You don't know what you've started, little girl. She didn't flinch. Neither do you. His lips twitched in amusement, but there was something else there now. A flicker of unease. He didn't expect her to be this good. Enjoy your victory, he said. It won't last. He turned and walked away before she could respond. Jasmine exhaled sharply. What the hell was that? That, Riley said, watching him go, was a warning. Later that night, Riley sat at the small kitchen table in her grandmother's apartment, scanning through every document one more time. Her laptop glowed faintly in the dim light, an open tab showing an article about Mather's previous legal troubles, all of which had mysteriously vanished before reaching trial. Evelyn Carter placed a cup of tea in front of her. You've got that look in your eyes again. Riley didn't glance up. What look? The one that says you already know what's about to happen next. She sighed, finally meeting her grandmother's gaze. Mathers isn't going to wait for trial. He's going to fight dirty. Evelyn stirred her tea slowly. Then you better be ready for it. Riley's phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. You don't want to do this. Drop the case. She stared at the screen, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Then, slowly, she typed back. See you in court. A moment later, the response came. You won't make it that far. Her fingers tightened around the phone. The next morning, Riley and Jasmine arrived at the courthouse early, preparing for a deposition with Andrea Sinclair. But as they approached the building, Riley's steps slowed. Police cars were lined up outside. Officers gathered near the entrance, murmuring in low tones. Jasmine grabbed her arm. What's going on? Riley didn't answer. Her stomach churned as she spotted one of the officers speaking with Calloway. And then her breath caught. Mathers was smirking. The officer turned, eyes landing on Riley. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Miss Carter? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Yes? I need you to come with me. We have some questions about the evidence you submitted. Jasmine's grip on her arm tightened. What? No, she didn't do anything wrong. The officer's face remained impassive. We received a report that some of the documents used in this case may have been tampered with. Until we can verify their authenticity, we need to bring Miss Carter in for questioning. Mathers let out a quiet chuckle behind them. Riley inhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. This was a move, a calculated, well-timed attack. They couldn't beat her in court, so they were trying to shake her before she even got there. Jasmine stepped in front of her. She's not going anywhere without a lawyer. She's not under arrest, the officer said. We just need to ask her some questions. Riley squared her shoulders. Then I'd like my legal counsel present. The officer hesitated, then nodded. That's your right. As he stepped aside, giving her space to make the call, she turned her head just enough to see Mathers watching her. His smirk was gone now, replaced with something colder. Calculating. This was only the beginning. And he wasn't done yet. The walls of the police station felt colder than they should have. Riley sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable as the officer across from her flipped through a file. He was deliberate in his movements, pausing just long enough on each page to let the weight of the silence settle. Jasmine had wanted to come, but Riley told her to wait outside. She knew this was a game, and she wasn't about to let Mathers see her rattled. Detective Wallace finally looked up. "You know why you're here?" Riley met his gaze without hesitation. "I was told there were concerns about my evidence." He leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "That's one way to put it. The defense claims some of the documents you submitted were altered. They're saying you fabricated records to mislead the court." Riley felt a flicker of anger, but kept her expression steady. "That's a lie." "Is it?" He slid a sheet across the table. "Because this report from the defense's forensic expert says otherwise." She glanced down. It was a document from Mathers' case file, one of the bank statements showing Jasmine's rent payments. Except now, there was an added annotation claiming the figures had been manipulated. Her jaw clenched. "This is fake." Wallace watched her carefully. "Can you prove that?" She inhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm. "The documents I submitted were verified. If Mathers' team has a different version, they're the ones who altered it." "That's a serious accusation. So is falsifying a police report." A beat of silence passed between them. The detective tapped his fingers against the desk, eyes narrowed. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back. "Look, kid, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but you're making enemies, real ones, people who don't like being challenged." Riley didn't blink. "That's their problem, not mine." Wallace shook his head. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" "No," she said simply. "I just know the law better than they do." The door swung open before he could respond. A tall, sharp-dressed man strode in, his presence commanding the room instantly. "That's enough," he said, setting a briefcase on the table. "My client won't be answering any more questions." Wallace sighed. "And you are?" "Gregory Holt," the man said smoothly. "Legal counsel." Riley exhaled in relief. Evelyn had called him, the family friend, the retired attorney who had taught Riley her first lessons in law. Holt turned to Riley. "Are you being charged with anything?" "No," Wallace admitted. "We're just having a conversation." "Then the conversation is over," Holt said, standing. "Miss Carter, let's go." Wallace didn't stop them. As they walked out, Riley caught sight of Mathers standing near the entrance. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a smug smile curling at the edges of his lips. She didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge him, but as she passed, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "You should have walked away." She kept walking. Outside, the crisp air felt sharper against her skin. Jasmine was pacing near the car, anxiety written all over her face. The moment she saw Riley, she rushed over. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Riley said. "But Mathers isn't playing fair." Jasmine scoffed. "Like that's new information." Holt crossed his arms. "They're trying to intimidate you. The easiest way to win is to make you quit before trial." "That's not happening," Riley said firmly. He studied her for a long moment. "You're good, kid, but you need to be careful. Mathers has money, power, and people willing to do his dirty work." "I know," Holt sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'll file a motion to have their claims investigated. If they tampered with evidence, we'll prove it. But you need to prepare for the next move." Riley nodded. "I already am." Jasmine frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Riley said, glancing back at the police station, "I'm done playing defense. It's time to hit back." The next morning, Riley sat at her laptop, scanning through records Holt had pulled for her. Financial statements, lease agreements, a tangled web of shell companies connected to Mathers. Aaron, her tech-savvy friend, leaned over her shoulder. "This guy's been laundering money through his properties for years. He's not just evicting people. He's using these fake violations to cover up the fact that he's hiding income." Riley's mind raced. "If we can prove that, we don't just win the case, we bury him." Aaron smirked. "I like the way you think." A knock at the door made them both turn. Evelyn stood there, her expression unreadable. "There's someone here to see you." Riley exchanged a glance with Aaron before heading to the front of the apartment. The moment she saw the woman standing in the doorway, her stomach twisted. Tall, blonde, expensive suit. But it was the cold sharpness in her eyes that sent a chill through Riley's spine. "Miss Carter," the woman said, offering a thin smile, "I represent some interested parties who believe this case has gotten a little out of hand." Riley's fingers curled into a fist. "And you are?" "Someone who could make your life a lot easier. Drop the case and we can discuss an arrangement." Evelyn's voice was firm. "She's not dropping anything." The woman barely acknowledged her. Her attention remained on Riley. "You're smart. You've proven that. But smart people know when to take the right deal. Don't be reckless, Miss Carter." Riley took a slow breath. "Let me guess. If I don't walk away, things get worse?" The woman smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Consider this your final warning." Then, just like that, she turned and walked away. Riley shut the door, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Erin whistled. "Well, that was subtle." Jasmine rubbed her temples. "What the hell do we do now?" Riley exhaled, already forming a plan. "Now?" Her voice was calm, steady. "Now we go to war." The woman's footsteps faded down the hall, but her words lingered. Riley stood by the door, jaw tight, heart pounding against her ribs. She wasn't surprised. She had been expecting this. The only thing that shocked her was how long it had taken them to send someone. Evelyn crossed her arms. That wasn't a warning. That was a threat. Erin let out a low whistle, and a fancy one at that. Jasmine looked pale. "You think they'll actually do something?" "They already did," Riley muttered. "First the cops, now this. Mathers is out of moves, so he's getting desperate." Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze firm. "You need to be careful. These people aren't like the bullies you've faced before." Riley's grip on the doorknob tightened. "I know." Jasmine exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "So what do we do? Just wait for them to try something worse?" Riley turned back to Erin. "How fast can you dig up everything on that woman?" Erin cracked his knuckles, already pulling out his phone. "Give me an hour." Riley nodded. "Then we don't wait, we move first." The next morning, Riley sat in the back of a crowded coffee shop, her laptop open in front of her. Erin slid into the seat across from her, tossing his phone onto the table. "Got her." She picked it up, scanning the screen. "Victoria Langley, corporate consultant, specializes in conflict resolution." Riley's fingers tightened around the phone. Conflict resolution. That was a cute way of saying she cleaned up messes for people like Mathers. Erin leaned in. "She's connected to at least 3 major real estate lawsuits in the last 5 years. Every single one of them got dropped before trial. You know what that tells me?" Riley met his gaze. "She pays people off." "Bingo." Jasmine slid into the booth next to Riley, lowering her voice. "We need to tell Holt." "We will," Riley said. "But first, we make this public." Jasmine frowned. "How?" Erin grinned. "Leave that to me." By noon, the internet was buzzing. A leaked email, sent anonymously to a few well-connected reporters, detailed Mathers' connection to Victoria Langley. A deep dive into her past cases exposed a pattern. Witness intimidation, settlements signed under duress, evidence that mysteriously vanished. The headline spread fast. Who is Victoria Langley, and what is she hiding? By evening, news outlets were calling for statements. Reporters camped outside Mathers' office. His legal team went silent. Riley sat on the couch, scrolling through the coverage. It wasn't enough to end him, but it was enough to put him on defense. For the first time, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Jasmine paced. "What now?" "Now," Riley said. "We wait for him to make a mistake." Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered. "This is Riley." Silence. Then a slow, deliberate voice. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Riley leaned back. "You're going to have to be more specific. A lot of people think that." A quiet chuckle. "Enjoy your moment. It won't last." The line went dead. Jasmine watched her. "Mathers? Maybe?" Riley tossed the phone onto the table. "Or someone worse." The next morning, Riley arrived at the courthouse early. She had barely stepped out of the car when she saw them, 2 men in dark suits standing near the entrance. They weren't reporters. They weren't lawyers. They were watching her. Jasmine grabbed her arm. "Tell me you see them too." "I see them." One of the men smirked when their eyes met. Riley didn't react. She turned and walked into the courthouse like she hadn't noticed them at all. Inside, Holt was waiting. He didn't waste time. "I saw the news. That was you, wasn't it?" Riley shrugged. "Just leveling the playing field." Holt exhaled sharply. "You're making enemies faster than I can keep up with." "They started it." He studied her for a long moment. Then reluctantly he nodded. Let's go. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery, murmuring in hushed tones. Mathers sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Calloway, his attorney, looked tense. Riley took her seat, her posture straight, her expression calm. But beneath the surface, she could feel it. Something was coming. Judge Graves entered, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Riley. He tapped his gavel. We're reconvening to address new developments in this case. Miss Carter, I understand you have additional evidence to present? Riley stood, sliding a folder onto the table. Yes, Your Honor. I have records showing a financial link between Mr. Mathers and Victoria Langley, the same Victoria Langley who has been connected to multiple cases of intimidation and legal coercion. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Calloway stood quickly. Objection. Irrelevant speculation. Judge Graves raised a hand. I'll decide what's relevant. Sit down, Mr. Calloway. Calloway clenched his jaw but obeyed. Judge Graves turned back to Riley. Continue. She opened the folder. I also have testimony from a former employee of Mr. Mathers, one who witnessed him discussing illegal evictions and falsified violations. A figure stood at the back of the courtroom, a man in his late 50s, neatly dressed, his expression grim. He stepped forward. The room tensed. Calloway turned pale. Mathers gripped the edge of the table. Riley's voice was steady. Your Honor, this is Robert Hale, Mr. Mathers' former property manager, and he's ready to testify. Judge Graves looked at the witness, then back at Mathers. Mr. Mathers, do you have any objections? Mathers didn't answer, because for the first time since this case started, he had nothing left to say. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Every eye was locked on Robert Hale, the former property manager who had just stepped forward. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. Mathers' fingers twitched against the table. Calloway leaned in, whispering something furiously into his ear. But the landlord didn't react. He was too busy staring at the man who could unravel everything. Judge Graves adjusted his glasses. Mr. Hale, do you understand that you're under oath? Hale nodded. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough but steady. I do. Riley didn't take her eyes off Mathers as she stepped forward. Mr. Hale, how long did you work for Mathers Properties? 15 years. And in that time, did you personally witness illegal evictions? A pause, then a slow nod. Yes, more than I can count. A ripple of gasps swept through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Mathers' jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white against the polished wood of the defense table. Calloway shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, this testimony is unverified. It's hearsay. Judge Graves cut him off. Overruled. Mr. Hale is testifying under oath. Continue, Miss Carter. Riley turned back to the witness. Can you describe how these evictions were carried out? Hale exhaled, his shoulders sagging. Mathers would target tenants he thought wouldn't fight back. Single parents, the elderly, people who didn't have the money for a lawyer. He'd make up violations, force them out, then raise the rent before bringing in someone else. And you helped him? Riley's voice didn't hold judgment, just a quiet demand for the truth. Hale swallowed hard. At first, I didn't ask questions. I needed the job, but after a while I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. I tried to quit once, and Mathers. His voice caught. He glanced at Mathers, then back at the judge. Mathers threatened my family, said if I ever spoke out, I'd regret it. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Even Judge Graves looked troubled now. Riley let the silence settle before she spoke again. Mr. Hale, why are you coming forward now? Hale met her gaze. Because I can't keep pretending I didn't know, and because I know what he's going to do to you if you don't stop him first. Mathers snapped. This is ridiculous. Judge Graves slammed his gavel. Enough, Mr. Mathers. But Mathers was beyond caring. He shot up from his seat, pointing a shaking finger at Hale. You're a liar. You were fired for stealing from my company. Riley didn't even blink. Do you have proof of that claim? Mathers faltered. His mouth opened, then closed, the realization sinking in too late. He had just made an accusation with no evidence to back it up. Riley turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I request that Mr. Hale's full testimony be entered into the record, and that Mathers be placed under investigation for perjury if he continues making baseless claims. Judge Graves exhaled sharply. So ordered. Calloway sat back, his expression unreadable. He knew they were losing ground fast. The The judge looked at Riley. "Miss Carter, do you have anything further?" She took a slow breath. "No, Your Honor. The facts speak for themselves." Judge Graves glanced around the room, his expression tight. "This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. Until then, we are adjourned." The gavel struck. Riley barely had time to gather her papers before Jasmine pulled her into a hug. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Riley let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Not yet. From across the room, Mathers was still staring at her, his face unreadable. But behind his eyes there was something dangerous, something unspoken. Calloway whispered something to him. Mathers gave a short nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Jasmine frowned. What was that? Riley's stomach twisted. I don't know. But she had a feeling she was about to find out. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was silent. Riley, Jasmine, and Aaron stepped out into the dimly lit space, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Aaron unlocked the car, but just as Riley reached for the handle, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. "Hello?" A low voice, smooth and calm. "You should have walked away, kid." Riley's grip tightened on the phone. "And you should have been smarter." A chuckle. "Then enjoy the victory while you can." The line went dead. Jasmine glanced at her. Who was that? Riley exhaled slowly. Someone who just made their last mistake. Aaron slid into the driver's seat. Where to? Riley's jaw set. Home. They pulled out of the garage, but as they turned onto the main road, Riley caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. A black SUV. It had been parked near the exit. Now it was following. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She just watched. 2 turns. 3. It stayed behind them. Jasmine noticed it next. Riley? I see it, she said quietly. Aaron tightened his grip on the wheel. What do you want to do? Riley's pulse was steady, her mind already working. Drive normal, she said. Let's see how bad they want this. The city lights blurred past. The SUV kept its distance, but it didn't turn away. They weren't trying to hide it. They wanted her to know. Her fingers curled into fists. They thought they could scare her. They thought wrong. The black SUV stayed in their rearview mirror, shadowing every turn. Riley kept her eyes locked on it, her mind racing through possibilities. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't paranoia. Aaron gripped the wheel, jaw trying to be subtle. Jasmine sat rigid in the back seat, her hands gripping the fabric of her jeans. This is bad, right? This is really bad. Riley exhaled slowly. We don't panic. We don't react. If they wanted to do something, they'd have done it already. Aaron's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. So what? We just let them follow us home? No. Riley glanced at the GPS on Aaron's phone. Take a left up ahead. Aaron hesitated. That's a dead-end street. Exactly. The SUV followed as expected, its headlights cutting through the dimly lit road. As soon as they reached the end of the street, Aaron slammed the brakes. The car jerked to a stop. Riley was already moving. She pushed open the door and stepped out, facing the vehicle that had been tailing them. For a second, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. A man in a suit stepped out, his expression calm, unreadable. Another man exited from the passenger side, larger, his arms crossed over his chest. The first man smiled. You're a hard person to reach, Miss Carter. Riley didn't flinch. And yet, here you are. Jasmine's voice was a whisper behind her. Riley? Aaron stayed in the car, engine running, ready. The man took a slow step forward. You've been making a lot of noise. Important people don't like that. Riley crossed her arms. Important people? Or just criminals who don't like getting caught? The man's smile didn't fade. Let's not play games. You're smart enough to know how this works. There's a way to settle things without making life difficult for everyone. You're here to threaten me? Not at all. His voice was smooth, practiced. I'm here to offer you a way out. You drop this case, and in return, we make sure you and your friends don't have to look over your shoulders for the rest of your lives. Riley stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It wasn't forced. It wasn't nervous. It was genuine. The man's smile faltered. Something funny? Yeah, Riley said, tilting her head. You think I'm afraid of you? The larger man took a step forward, but the first man held up a hand, stopping him. His expression darkened. I think you're smart enough to recognize when you're outmatched. Riley's gaze never wavered. If I back down now, I might as well never show my face again. So no, I'm not dropping this case, and if you really want me to be afraid, you're gonna have to try harder than this." The man studied her, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, after a beat, he sighed, shaking his head. "Shame." He turned, walking back to the SUV. The other man lingered a second longer, his gaze hard before following. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. Riley turned back to the car. Jasmine looked like she might throw up. Aaron let out a low breath. "That was either the bravest or dumbest thing I've ever seen." Riley slid back into her seat. "They're testing me, seeing if I'll crack." Jasmine's voice was shaky. "And if you don't?" Riley glanced out the window, watching the SUV's taillights vanish into the distance. "Then they'll come back." By the time she got home, exhaustion was settling into her bones, but she knew she wouldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn watching her with that knowing look. "You're pushing them into a corner," her grandmother said. "Good." Evelyn sighed, "And when cornered animals lash out, then I'll be ready." Her phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at the screen. An email, no subject line, no sender name, just an attachment. She opened it. A single image loaded on the screen. A picture of her standing outside the courthouse earlier that day. The timestamp in the corner was barely an hour old. Riley stared at it, her pulse steady, controlled. They were watching her. Evelyn peered over her shoulder. "What is it?" Riley locked her phone and stood. "Nothing, just a reminder." Evelyn didn't push, but Riley could feel her watching as she walked toward her room. The weight of the night pressed against her shoulders, but she didn't let it sink in. Not yet. She had work to do. The next day, the courtroom was even more crowded. The press had doubled. Mathers sat stiffly at the defense table, Calloway whispering furiously in his ear. They knew things were slipping. Riley took her seat, her expression unreadable. Judge Graves entered, his gaze sharp as he looked between both parties. "We will now proceed with closing arguments." Calloway stood first, adjusting his tie. His voice was smooth, confident, but there was a tightness around his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot of claims, but at the end of the day, where is the proof? The plaintiff's case is built on speculation and accusations, nothing concrete." He turned slightly, leveling his gaze at Riley. "Miss Carter has put on quite a show, but the law isn't about performances, it's about facts." He sat. The room was silent. Then Riley stood. She didn't pick up her papers, didn't glance at her notes. She simply looked at the jury. "My client followed every rule, paid her rent, did everything right, and yet she was told to leave. Why?" Her voice was steady, deliberate. "Because Glenn Mathers built his wealth on fraud, on targeting people he thought couldn't fight back. He used fear, manipulation, and lies to make sure no one ever challenged him." She let the words settle. But today someone did. Her eyes flicked to Mathers. He was rigid, his fists clenched beneath the table. "And now you have a choice," she said. "You can let him keep doing this, or you can finally put a stop to it." She sat down. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Judge Graves tapped his gavel. "This court is now in recess. The jury will deliberate." Riley exhaled. It was out of her hands now, but she wasn't done yet. The courthouse hallways buzzed with tension. Riley sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, elbows resting on her knees, fingers interlocked. The jury was deliberating, and the weight of the waiting settled heavy in her chest. Jasmine paced a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself. "How long does this usually take?" Holt checked his watch, leaning against the wall. "Could be an hour, could be all day." Jasmine exhaled sharply. "Great, love that." Aaron sat next to Riley, text scrolling through his phone. The press is eating this up. Social media is blowing up with Mathers' trial. Riley barely heard them. Her focus was locked on the doors ahead, waiting for the moment they would open, waiting for the decision that could change everything. The minutes dragged. Each second felt stretched, pulled tight with anticipation. Then the door creaked. A bailiff stepped out. "The jury has reached a verdict." Jasmine froze mid-step. Aaron sat up straighter. Holt exhaled, pushing off the wall. Riley stood. Her heartbeat was steady. This was it. They filed back inside, the gallery packed tighter than before. Reporters whispered among themselves, pens poised, cameras ready. Mathers sat stiffly at the defense table, his face blank, but Riley saw the tension in his hands, the way his fingers curled against the wood. Calloway sat beside him, expression unreadable. Judge Graves entered, his face impassive as always. He tapped his gavel once. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, stood. She held a folded sheet of paper in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." Riley kept her breathing even. The sheet was passed to the bailiff, then to the judge. Graves unfolded it, scanning the contents. A flicker of something crossed his face, too fast to read. He looked up. "Please read the verdict." The woman nodded, clearing her throat. "In the matter of Lewis versus Mathers Properties, we, the jury, find the defendant," a pause, "liable for fraudulent eviction practices and unlawful intimidation of tenants." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Jasmine gasped, gripping Riley's arm. Mathers' face drained of color. Calloway shut his eyes briefly, like he had seen the loss coming, but still hated the reality of it. Judge Graves nodded. "The court acknowledges the jury's decision. Damages will be determined in a separate hearing. This trial is adjourned." The gavel struck. For a beat, no one moved. Then Jasmine let out a choked laugh. "We won." The words barely felt real. Aaron whooped, clapping Riley on the back. Reporters scrambled, voices rising as they tried to push through the crowd. Riley remained still, absorbing it all, letting the weight of the moment sink in. They had done it. Mathers shoved his chair back, standing so abruptly the legs screeched against the floor. His face was red with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly Riley thought he might snap a tooth. "You think this is over?" His voice was low, dangerous. Holt stepped in front of Riley before she could respond. "Watch yourself, Mathers." Mathers ignored him, his glare locked on Riley. "You don't understand what you've started, kid. You think this was a win? This was just a battle. The war's not over." Riley tilted her head. "Then I guess I'll see you on the battlefield." Security moved in before anything else could be said, guiding Mathers toward the exit. Reporters swarmed, flashes going off, microphones shoved forward, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. Riley exhaled, turning to Jasmine. "Are you okay?" Jasmine nodded, tears in her eyes. "I can finally breathe again." A warmth spread through Riley's chest. This was why she had fought. This was why she had refused to back down. The battle might not be over, but today, they had won. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting. Cameras, reporters, flashing lights. Riley hesitated at the doors. She had spent the entire case focused on the fight itself. She hadn't thought about what came after. Holt nudged her shoulder. "You up for this?" She squared her shoulders. "Always." They stepped out. Questions flew from every direction. "Miss Carter, what do you have to say about the verdict? How does it feel to have taken down Mathers? Do you think this case will set a precedent for future housing lawsuits?" Riley raised a hand. The noise settled. She met the gaze of every reporter, every camera, every person watching. This wasn't just about one case. This was about a system that lets people like Mathers get away with hurting others. Today that system lost. And I hope this is just the beginning. A final flash of cameras, a final wave of questions. Then finally she stepped away. The sky was clearer than it had been in weeks, the air lighter. Jasmine pulled her into a tight hug. "Thank you," Aaron smirked. "So what now? Gonna take on the whole corrupt real estate industry?" Riley smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. Maybe. The world was watching now, and she wasn't done yet. The cameras had finally stopped flashing. The reporters had moved on to file their stories. The crowd outside the courthouse had thinned, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed against Riley's chest. Jasmine sat on the courthouse steps, staring at the sky like she was seeing it for the first time in years. Aaron scrolled through his phone, smirking at the headlines. "Teen lawyer destroys corrupt landlord in court." Glenn Mathers exposed. What's next for the real estate mogul? Riley Carter, the girl who took on the system and won. He whistled. "You're famous now." Riley sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Yeah, great." Jasmine looked over, brow furrowed. "You don't sound excited." "It's not over." Riley's voice was steady, but inside she could feel it, that quiet pull of something unfinished. "Mathers isn't going to take this loss and disappear." Aaron tilted his phone toward them. "He's already working on damage control. Statement just dropped. This trial was a farce. The jury was biased. I intend to fight this ruling in every way possible." Jasmine groaned. "Of course he does." Riley wasn't surprised. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the envelope waiting on the windshield of Aaron's car. She spotted it first. a crisp white rectangle tucked neatly under the wiper. Her stomach clenched as she stepped forward, plucking it free. No name. No return address. Just her name, printed in bold black ink. Aaron and Jasmine crowded behind her as she tore it open. A single sheet of paper, one sentence. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Jasmine inhaled sharply. Tell me that's not creepy as hell. Aaron's jaw tightened. This Mathers? Riley read the words again, her grip tightening. I don't think so. The letters were too precise, too calculated. Mathers was all about ego, about making a scene. This was different. Jasmine frowned. Then who? Riley folded the paper, slipping it into her pocket. Someone else. Someone who was paying attention. Aaron started the car. So what now? Riley glanced at the courthouse one last time. Now, she said, we find out who else doesn't want me digging. The knock on Evelyn Carter's door came late that night. Riley had barely taken off her shoes when she heard it, 3 firm, deliberate raps against the wood. Her grandmother looked up from the couch, frowning. You expecting someone? Riley shook her head. She approached the door slowly, pulse steady, controlled, peered through the peephole. A woman stood on the other side, her features sharp, her posture stiff. She wasn't a reporter. She wasn't from the press. Riley opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. Can I help you? The woman didn't smile. My name is Monica Lane. I work with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Riley's grip on the doorknob tightened. And Monica pulled out a business card, sliding it through the gap in the door. We need to talk. Riley took the card, turning it over between her fingers. Federal prosecutor. Evelyn stood behind her now, silent but watchful. Monica's expression didn't waver. I've been watching your case. Mathers was small time compared to the people you just exposed. You shook something loose, Miss Carter, and now I need your help. Riley didn't move, didn't blink. Then she opened the door wider. Come in. The air inside the apartment felt heavier, with Monica Lane sitting across from her. The woman had the kind of presence that made silence feel dangerous, like she could hear things that weren't being said. Evelyn set down a cup of tea in front of her. Monica didn't touch it. Her eyes were on Riley. You disrupted something bigger than you realize. Riley leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Then why don't you tell me what I'm up against? Monica exhaled, choosing her words carefully. Mathers was small time, but he wasn't acting alone. His business was connected to a network of fraudulent real estate deals, money laundering, shell companies hiding illegal funds. And now, because of your case, that network is panicking. Riley felt a cold weight settle in her chest. You're telling me I didn't just take down a slumlord, I stepped on a landmine. Monica nodded. And now the people behind it are deciding what to do about you. Evelyn's voice was sharp. Are you saying my granddaughter's in danger? Monica didn't look away from Riley. I'm saying she has a choice. Walk away now, let the professionals handle this, and you might avoid what's coming. Riley let the words hang between them. She had spent weeks fighting to bring Mathers down. Now she was supposed to step aside because the stakes were too high? She shook her head. Not happening. Monica studied her, then let out a quiet laugh. I figured you'd say that. She reached into her briefcase, pulling out a thin folder. Then you need to see what you're up against. Riley flipped it open. Pages of financial records, internal memos, encrypted emails. Some of the names listed weren't surprising. Mathers' business partners, corporate investors. But one name stood out, sending a chill through her veins. Victoria Langley. Riley's fingers tightened around the paper. Monica watched her closely. I see you recognize the name. She did. The woman who had shown up at her door. The one who had offered her a way out before things got ugly. Riley had thought Mathers was her only problem, but this was something else entirely. Evelyn frowned. Who is she? Monica's voice was calm, controlled. A fixer. The kind of person corporations hire when they need problems to disappear. Jasmine's warning from days ago echoed in Riley's mind. And if you don't back down? She set the folder down. Then I guess I'm her next problem. The night air was thick as Riley stepped outside, phone pressed to her ear. Aaron's voice came through the line, laced with concern. You're telling me Mathers was just the beginning? Looks like it. A low whistle. Damn. You ever think about picking an easier hobby? Riley exhaled. Not my style. She glanced up, eyes scanning the street. A dark car sat parked at the end of the block. No movement inside, but she knew it wasn't a coincidence. Aaron picked up on the silence. You okay? Yeah, she said. Just being watched. Again. She could hear the tension in his voice. You need me to do something? Riley's grip on the phone tightened. Yeah, find everything you can on Victoria Langley. Aaron didn't hesitate. On it. She ended the call, slipping her phone into her pocket. The car at the end of the street didn't move. Neither did she. A test. She turned and walked back inside. The second the door shut, the car's headlights flicked on. They wanted her to know they were there. She locked the door behind her. Morning came with a new message on her phone. No number, no name, just a single line of text. You were warned. Riley stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back. Not enough. The reply was almost instant. Then you'll learn the hard way. She closed the message. Jasmine's voice came from behind her. Who was that? Riley set her phone down. No one important. Jasmine gave her a look. You know that's a lie. Riley didn't argue. Aaron burst in through the door, laptop in hand, eyes wide. I found something. He dropped the laptop onto the table, pulling up a document. It was an old financial report, buried under layers of false names and redirected accounts. But at the center of it was Langley Industries. Aaron pointed. Victoria Langley doesn't just clean up messes. She owns part of this operation. She's not working for someone else. She is the someone else. Riley stared at the screen, the weight of the discovery settling in her gut. Jasmine's voice was barely a whisper. You just picked a fight with one of the most powerful people in the city. Aaron nodded. Yeah, and she knows it. Riley closed the laptop. Good? Riley pushed through the courthouse doors, her pulse steady but sharp. The air inside buzzed with low murmurs, a tension thick enough to cut through. This wasn't just another hearing. Something was off. Aaron caught up beside her. They're pulling something. I can feel it. Jasmine flipped through her phone, scanning the latest headlines. There's already chatter online. Someone leaked documents claiming your evidence was tampered with. Riley clenched her jaw. Langley's making her move. The moment they stepped into the courtroom, she saw it. Victoria Langley sat at the defense table, perfectly poised, a thin smile curving at the edges of her lips. Next to her, Calloway adjusted his tie, radiating confidence he hadn't had the day before. Something had changed. Judge Graves entered, tapping his gavel. Court is now in session. Calloway stood first. Your Honor, before we proceed, the defense has obtained new evidence that calls the integrity of this case into question. A folder slid across the table. Riley's stomach twisted. Judge Graves flipped it open, skimming the contents. His frown deepened. Explain. Calloway adjusted his cuffs. These documents suggest that key financial records submitted by the plaintiff were altered. If true, this would constitute evidence tampering, which would justify an immediate dismissal of the case. A wave of whispers rippled through the gallery. Riley forced her breathing to stay even. She turned toward Langley, who wasn't even looking at her, as if she already knew how this would end. Judge Graves exhaled sharply. Miss Carter, do you have a response? Riley stood. Yes, Your Honor. She stepped forward, keeping her voice clear. The defense is claiming our evidence was falsified, but if that were true, why didn't they challenge it before now? Why wait until the 11th hour? Calloway's smirk faltered slightly. Riley pressed on. Because they created this problem. They needed time to fabricate their own evidence to bury this case. Langley finally glanced at her, amusement flickering in her eyes. Judge Graves raised a hand. Do you have proof of this claim, Miss Carter? Aaron slid a file into Riley's hand. She didn't even have to look. It was exactly what she needed. She placed it on the table. Your Honor, we anticipated something like this, which is why we had our financial records independently verified before they were submitted to the court. She turned toward Langley and Calloway. Nice try, though. Judge Graves reviewed the documents, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he set them aside. The defense's motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed. A mix of relief and tension filled the room. Calloway's jaw tightened. Langley, however, was still smiling. Riley didn't like that. As court adjourned, she grabbed her bag, heading for the exit. But just before she reached the door, a quiet voice stopped her. Impressive work, Miss Carter. She turned. Langley stood just a few feet away, calm, composed. But you should know something, Langley continued. You haven't won. You've just made yourself a bigger target. Riley held her gaze. Then you should know something too. She leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but firm. I don't miss. Langley's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted. A flicker of recognition, of something close to respect. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Riley exhaled, rolling her shoulders. One battle down, but the war had just begun. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, voices overlapping in a chaotic blur. Riley barely heard them. The rush of adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, the weight of Langley's warning settling deep in her chest. Aaron nudged her. We need to go. Jasmine grabbed her arm. They're waiting for a statement. Riley exhaled, turning to face the press. A reporter stepped forward. Miss Carter, how do you respond to the defense's latest attempt to dismiss the case? Riley met his gaze, her voice steady. The facts speak for themselves. They tried to bury the truth, and they failed. We're not stopping. Another voice cut in. Are you worried about retaliation? Riley's jaw tightened. I think the real question is, why are they so afraid of this case going to trial? More questions, more cameras flashing, but Riley was already moving, pushing through the crowd. As they reached the car, Aaron opened the door, but before Riley could get in, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. Yeah? A voice, smooth and unhurried. You like to play with fire, don't you? Langley. Riley leaned against the car. Didn't expect you to call personally. A soft chuckle. I like to watch my investments closely, and you, Miss Carter, are becoming quite an expensive problem. Riley smirked. That's funny. I was about to say the same thing about you. Langley's tone didn't shift. You got lucky today, but luck runs out. You don't have to keep making this difficult. Riley glanced at the courthouse behind her. Difficult for who? You? Calloway? Or the people who've been profiting off this scam for years? Langley exhaled, slow and deliberate. I'll give you one last chance to walk away. A clean slate, no consequences, but if you refuse. Riley finished for her. Then I'll regret it? A pause, then softly. No, but someone else will. The line went dead. Riley lowered the phone, her fingers gripping it tightly. Aaron frowned. What was that? Riley didn't answer. She was already dialing another number. Holt picked up on the second ring. Carter? They're getting desperate, she said. Langley just called me herself. Holt cursed under his breath. What did she say? That I should walk away. That someone else would pay if I didn't. A sharp inhale. You think she means your grandmother? Riley's chest tightened. I think she means whoever she wants. Silence stretched between them. Then Holt spoke, his voice firm. Then it's time we hit back first. Riley glanced at Aaron and Jasmine. They were both watching her, waiting for the next move. She nodded once. Let's burn this whole thing down. The night air was thick with tension. Riley sat in the back of Aaron's car, phone pressed to her ear, listening as Holt laid out the plan. We need to force their hand, he said. If Langley thinks she's in control, she'll keep pushing. We need to make her react. Riley stared out the window, watching the city blur past. And how do we do that? A pause. Then Holt spoke carefully. We go after her money. Jasmine turned from the front seat. You mean the offshore accounts? Aaron smirked. You need a hacker for that? Riley sighed. You're not a hacker. Aaron shrugged. I know a guy. Riley ignored him. What do you need from me, Holt? Pressure, he said. We need Langley to feel like she's losing control, and we need her to make a mistake. Riley nodded. Then let's give her a reason to panic. By morning, the first news report dropped. Sources suggest Langley Industries is under investigation for financial misconduct. Then another. Leaked documents raise questions about Victoria Langley's real estate empire. Within hours, the internet was flooded with speculation, questions, whispers of fraud, and Langley noticed. Riley sat at the cafe across from the courthouse, watching as Langley's car pulled up. Calloway was already waiting for her, a phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight. They're scrambling, Jasmine murmured. Riley took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. You seem busy. Langley's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. That was clever. I didn't think you had it in you. Riley smirked. There's a lot you don't know about me. A pause. Then Langley said, You think this changes anything? Riley glanced out the window. I think you wouldn't be calling me if it didn't. Another pause. Then Langley exhaled, slow and deliberate. Enjoy your little victory, Miss Carter. It won't last. The line went dead. Riley set her phone down, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Langley was starting to crack. And that was exactly what she needed. The office smelled like burnt coffee and stress. Holt paced behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, while Riley, Aaron, and Jasmine sat across from him watching. The news reports had done their job. Langley was in damage control mode. Holt ended the call and exhaled sharply. They're scrambling, but that also means they're dangerous. Aaron leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. So what's next? We just keep pushing until they break? Holt rubbed his temples. No, we need something concrete, something that can't be spun in the media. Riley knew what he meant. A witness? Jasmine frowned. We already have Robert Hale. His testimony on Mathers should be enough. Holt shook his head. Hale can bury Mathers, but not Langley. We need someone closer, someone inside. Aaron smirked. Then we find a rat. By evening, Riley sat in front of her laptop, scanning lists of former Langley employees. Most were clean, people who had left on good terms, but one name stood out. Daniel Cross, Langley's former legal consultant, the same man who had tried to bribe her a few days ago. Jasmine leaned over her shoulder. Think he'll talk? Aaron grinned. If Langley dropped him, he's probably pissed. That's the best kind of rat. Riley didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed the number listed on his last known contact. It rang. Once, twice, then a voice, cautious. Who is this? Riley leaned forward. The last person who's going to offer you a deal before this whole thing burns down. A pause. Then Cross exhaled. Meet me in an hour. The diner was half empty, the neon sign flickering above the window. Cross sat in the back booth, looking older than he had a week ago. Stress had a way of doing that. He didn't greet them as Riley slid into the seat across from him. You're making a mistake, Carter, Riley smirked. People keep saying that. Cross rubbed his jaw. But you don't understand what you're up against. Riley leaned in. Then explain it to me. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Cross sighed. Langley doesn't just own real estate. She owns people. Judges, politicians, cops. This isn't just fraud. It's power. And if you think she won't destroy you to keep it, you're dead wrong. Jasmine's voice was sharp. Then why are you here? Cross hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled a USB drive from his pocket and slid it across the table. Because I want out. Riley picked it up. What's on this? Everything, Cross said. Internal emails, financial transfers, names. Enough to take her down. Aaron's eyes widened. Damn. Riley studied Cross. Why give this to me? His jaw tightened. Because I know what happens to people who go against her. Riley didn't look away. Then you'd better hope we win. Cross nodded once. Yeah, I guess I do. Outside, the streetlights buzzed. The city moved on, unaware that the game had just changed. Riley held the drive in her palm, feeling the weight of it. This was it. The final piece. Now it was time to end this. The USB drive sat on the table between them, small but heavier than anything Riley had ever held. This was it, the end game. Holt inserted the drive into his laptop, scanning through the files. His expression remained unreadable, but Riley saw the tension in his shoulders. Jasmine leaned forward. Is it real? Holt exhaled slowly. Oh, it's real. Aaron whistled. How bad? Holt rubbed his temples. This isn't just real estate fraud. This is bribery, racketeering, tax evasion. Langley isn't just scamming tenants, she's laundering money through shell companies, paying off judges, funneling millions into off-the-books accounts. Jasmine's eyes widened. Enough to bury her? Holt looked at Riley. Enough to bury everyone involved. Riley's fingers drummed against the table. Then we go public. Holt hesitated. We need to be careful. If Langley sees this coming, she'll move her assets, cut ties, destroy whatever evidence she can before this reaches court. Aaron nodded. So we hit her hard and fast. Holt sighed. I'll pull some strings, get this in front of the right people. But Riley... He looked at her seriously. Once we do this, there's no going back. Riley met his gaze. I was never going back. The first leak hit the news within hours. Anonymous source exposes financial crimes linked to Langley Industries. Then another. High-profile investors tied to corruption scandal. More to come? By morning, the internet was in chaos. Reporters camped outside Langley's office. Government agencies were forced to respond, and then the call came. Riley picked up without hesitation. Langley's voice was quieter than before. No amusement, no arrogance, just cold. You think you've won? Riley didn't blink. I think you sound nervous. A long pause. Then Langley exhaled. You don't understand what you've done, Riley smirked. I think I understand perfectly. Langley's voice dropped lower. Do you really believe this is over? That I don't have contingencies? Riley's grip on her phone tightened. I don't care how many backup plans you have. You lost control of this, and you know it. Another pause. Then, for the first time, Langley sounded human. Not untouchable, not invincible, just angry. You should have taken the deal, Miss Carter. The line went dead. Riley set her phone down, heart pounding. Jasmine watched her. What did she say? Riley exhaled, steadying herself. She's scared, Aaron grinned. Good. Holt checked his watch. Then let's finish this. Riley nodded. Let's end her. The storm had finally hit. The courthouse was surrounded, reporters, cameras, onlookers, all waiting for the moment Victoria Langley walked inside. The air buzzed with tension, whispers of indictments, arrest warrants, and federal investigations swirling like wildfire. Riley stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching as Langley's black SUV pulled up to the curb. Aaron whistled. Think she'll make a scene? Jasmine shook her head. She doesn't need to. She's already lost. The door opened, and Langley stepped out, dressed in her signature power suit, sunglasses shielding her expression. She moved with the same cold confidence, but Riley saw it now. The cracks beneath the surface. Langley didn't look at the cameras. She didn't even acknowledge the reporters shouting her name. Instead, she walked straight toward Riley. A hush fell over the crowd. Langley stopped just inches away, removing her sunglasses slowly, her piercing gaze locking onto Riley's. You should be careful, Miss Carter, she murmured, just loud enough for only Riley to hear. Riley didn't flinch. You should be worried, Miss Langley. A slight smirk curled at Langley's lips. Do you really think this is over? Riley held her ground. I think you've already lost. You just haven't figured out how to accept it yet. Langley exhaled slowly, studying her. Then, with a quiet chuckle, she slid her sunglasses back on. Enjoy your victory while you can, she said, stepping past Riley toward the courthouse doors. The cameras flashed. The headlines were already writing themselves. Victoria Langley faces federal charges. The moment she disappeared inside, Aaron let out a low breath. Damn, that was intense. Jasmine grinned. I think we just watched history happen. Riley's phone buzzed. A message. Well played, Miss Carter. But remember, power never truly disappears. It just waits for the next move. No name, no number. But Riley didn't need one. She already knew. Langley might have lost today. But the game was never really over. My friend, so the story has come to an end. Are you still here? If you've made it this far, it means you felt something. It means this story mattered to you. And that means more than you know. But now I want to hear your thoughts. What did this story make you feel? What would you have done in Riley's place? Drop a comment below. I'm reading every single one. And if this story stayed with you, hit that like button, share it, and make sure you're following. Because stories end. But the conversations? They're just getting started.